My name is E.C. Sinkowski. I work for CrossFit headquarters, and I'm also one of their trainers on their weekend seminars. And Eric asked me to come tonight to talk about kind of practical nutrition information, maybe not quite as much of the science and more about like the day-to-day choices. And so that's what we're going to talk about, how to put CrossFit's dietary guideline into practice. And when I talk about CrossFit's dietary guideline, it's really the first two sentences of what leads off our elite fitness in 100 words. And I've got it up on the board, and I'm sure you've heard it before. Eat meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, little starch, and no sugar. And the second sentence is, keep intake to levels that support exercise, but not body fat. And so what we're going to do is we're kind of going to walk through this and kind of unpack it in terms of making those day-to-day choices. But before we get into that, we kind of got to go over a few different basic concepts. And the first is food is our fuel for metabolism. Metabolism is all of the chemical processes that go on necessary to maintain life, also to produce energy, to do CrossFit. And food gives us nutrients for metabolism, and we really classify those nutrients in two different broad categories. There are macronutrients and micronutrients. For the macronutrients, we have three of these. I know you all know what they are. What are they? Carbs, protein, and fat, correct. And then we've got micronutrients. What are those? Yeah, minerals, vitamins, exactly. And so the distinguishing characteristic between macro and micronutrients, I mean, the name sort of gives it away with macro and micro. Macro you need in large quantities, micro you need in small quantities. So macronutrients are the significant source of calories to the diet, micronutrients not so much. And so macronutrients get a lot of attention because they are sort of the lion's share of where we're deriving our energy. But we can't blow off micronutrients completely because those are also very necessary for optimal health and performance. We need a whole host of vitamins and minerals to be able to produce ATP to do energy and to do it efficiently in CrossFit. So we need these vitamins and minerals. Now, I think what gets confusing about micronutrients is there's a lot of them. And we could be here all night just talking about the different vitamins and minerals, their roles in the body, the sources that you can get those vitamins and minerals from. But at the end of that, although that could be really interesting, I don't think that level of detail or scrutiny is necessary for people to be able to kind of put it into practice if you understand kind of two big concepts. And the first concept is nutrient density, and this really applies to both macronutrients and micronutrients. And what I mean by nutrient density is how much or how many micro and macronutrients are you getting per calorie of food. And the way I like to think about that is kind of like bang for your buck. I want to get the best coverage across macro and micronutrients I can per calorie of food. What types of foods do you think have the best kind of coverage or their most nutrient-dense sources? Come on, you guys know. It's the name of a supermarket around the corner. Whole Foods, all right? Whole Foods are going to be our most nutrient-dense sources. Something that looks like how it exists in the environment. As soon as something is processed, we have nutrient loss. So in terms of getting the most bang for our buck, the most macro and micronutrients that we need for health and performance, we're going to rely on whole foods. The other concept besides nutrient density is kind of nutrient synergy. And what I mean by that is whole foods have a whole array of vitamins and minerals within each one. So carrots, for example, people will say, well, that's a really great source of vitamin A, and that's true, but it's also a source of vitamin E, vitamin B6, iron, etc. And what research is sort of showing is that when we take in vitamins and minerals in these whole foods, it's better for us and it's more beneficial than if we were to take out a single mineral, a single vitamin, isolate it in supplementation. Meaning there's a synergistic effect of those vitamins and minerals in the whole food that we haven't been able to reproduce ourselves as man in isolation. Does that make sense? Cool. So we're not going to go over all the different micronutrients tonight, but if you keep in mind, hey, I can get a lot of them from nutrient-dense foods, and that's going to be whole foods, and they're better for me in that combination, that's all you really have to know. Except for we do recommend fish oil just because it's so hard to keep omega-6s out of our diet. Now, if you eat grass-fed and pasture-raised meat, and you really limit your nut consumption, and you eat fish a few times a week, you actually probably don't need fish oil. But For other people, you eat out more often, you have this nut consumption, that's when we do recommend some fish oil to try to counteract that omega-6 and omega-3 balance. And that's going to be about on the order of 3 grams of EPA or DHA. And I was trying to think of a way to come up with explaining how to answer your own nutrition questions. I mean, I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have at the best of my ability, but I would kind of want to try to convey, like, well, what's kind of the thought process to go into, should I have this or should I not have this? And nutrition always brings up the what about questions, what about honey and what about dairy and what about, dried fruit, you name it. And typically I kind of come back to that person with 2 questions. The first one is, well, where are you relative to where you want to be? And 2, how much are we talking about? The first question, where are you relative to where you want to be? Are you lean? Are you fit? Are you healthy? That's going to tell us, are you, in excess already? Or are we at levels that are supporting exercise? Obviously, if we're excess, that's probably going to lean us towards, hey, maybe this less desirable food is not something we want to include. The second one was, well, how much are we talking about? Because quantity is always going to matter to some degree. Honey is a great example. I get questions about honey all the time, right? Honey's paleo. And so people will tell me, oh, you can have it. It's paleo. It's perfect. And then if we talk about what honey really is, it's that sugar source, right? And I even said that it's a little bit higher fructose than glucose in honey. So we probably don't want to rely on it a huge amount. And so people say, oh, you should never have honey. It's terrible for you. It's just like sugar. It is sugar. There's probably sort of a middle ground there. I mean, imagine this scenario. Imagine I had a lean CrossFitter who comes up to me. They're fit. They're performing well. No known health effects. And they say to me, well, you know what? My diet's meat and vegetables and fruits, but I put a half tablespoon of honey every morning in my coffee. Should I give up the honey? It's like, well, sounds like performance is going well. You're really lean. It's not an excessive amount. It's a controlled quantity. Go for it. I don't hear a lot of sugar is in their diet elsewhere. Keep it up, is what I would say. I've had the other situation where I've had people who are looking to lean out, and they're on, let's say, a paleo challenge at their gym, where it's a challenge, based on just quality of food, not necessarily any quantity. And they'll say, well, I know, honey's paleo. Can I include it? My answer to that person is probably going to be no, right? I mean, I don't have any sense that they're controlling the quantity. It's got fructose. I know they're trying to lean out. That's probably going to meddle the process. And so that person was going to hear, no, they're not where they want to be. They're not at their goal state of what they're looking for. What's another example? Like dried fruit, right? Can we have dried fruit? It's not paleo, And assuming we're talking about the dried fruit that's not covered in sugar, I'm sure that you can, at this point, say that's probably not ideal. It's just fruit dried, right? So if it's still falling within the same portion sizes that you would have by eating fresh fruit, I say go for it. Last night I had a hamburger and a bunch of asparagus and 2 dried figs. I think that's perfectly healthy, and hopefully that you can see that amount of quantity of dried fruit, it's not terrible. Now, because dried fruit, we can eat a lot more of it, the water weight's gone, so we can kind of nosh through it, you can see that at a certain quantity, it's going to start being a problem. So if we can kind of get back to the peanut M&M question, the first question is, where are you relative to where you want to be? Are you at the performance and body composition that you want? And then, if the answer is no, then we probably want to ratchet back the amount of peanut M&Ms that we're having. And maybe if we're doing peanut M&Ms on Saturday night to keep us sane through the rest of the week, my answer is going to be keep doing it. But if it's daily to kind of get us through because we're so hungry, hey, let's find something else to rely on a regular basis. Does that make sense? Cool. So we're going to start with this first sentence. You can see eat meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, little starch, and no sugar. Those are whole foods. And the first one we've got is meat. What nutrients are we getting from meat? Good, love it. Protein. What else? Yeah, fat. And of course, some of these micronutrients. Now, in the meat category, we're going to go ahead and include eggs and fish as well as an animal source of protein. When we talk about protein sources, we can really classify these as complete or incomplete protein sources. And basically, proteins are broken down into amino acids. That's just the building blocks of protein in our body. And a complete protein source has all the amino acids that we need. Our body does not produce all of them. Complete protein sources come from animal sources. An incomplete protein source would be something like from a plant source, and of course that does not have all the amino acids that our body needs. And so that's one of the reasons that we really like meat. It's a very nutrient-dense source of proteins for us, and proteins are used for virtually everything in our body. Pretty much all of our structural tissues are made of proteins. Proteins drive all of these metabolic processes, so we're going to need to have our bases covered with that, and that's why we default to meat in terms of protein. Now, meat also has fat, and when we talk about fat, there are 3 types of fat. What are those? Saturated. What else? Yeah, we've got unsaturated types, and there's 2 of them. So we've got the monounsaturated, and we've got the polyunsaturated. And just like protein, fat has a lot of different functions for us. Fat, we use it for energy. It insulates our organs. It's involved with vitamin regulation. We use it for hormone manufacture. So we need to have fat in our diet. And we need to have different types of fat in our diet. And these different types, we classify them based on their chemical structure. And it's really based on the stability of the molecule. And when I talk about stability, it means how prone they are to oxidation. If one of these fats is oxidized, it can break down into smaller pieces and cause damage to your protein, your DNA, which is not ideal. In terms of stability, saturated fat is the most stable, monounsaturated fat is the second most stable, and polyunsaturated fat is the least stable. So probably, hopefully you're thinking, well, I don't want to maximize the quantity of the least stable fats. I don't want to maximize the amount of polyunsaturated fats in my diet, and that's true. And if you're wondering, okay, well, how much saturated, monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat should I have? You know, I haven't really seen the definitive answer on that. I don't know if we ever will. But probably an equal balance across all 3 fat sources is a good idea. So 30% of your fat calories would be saturated, 30% polyunsaturated, and 30% monounsaturated. Now, what makes that difficult in terms of like actually figuring out exactly where I'm getting my different fat sources is that when you have a food that has fat in it, it's in a combination of all of those fats. So for example, people will, you'll hear that beef is a really high source of saturated fat, and it's true, it has saturated fat, but it also has an equal amount of monounsaturated fat as saturated fat, with a small balance being left to polyunsaturated fat. And so that's going to be true for all different types of meat and for seafood and for eggs. And instead of making yourself mad trying to know exactly, which meat has which kind of fatty acid balance, my sort of practical recommendation is just rotate your meat sources. Have beef, have chicken, have seafood, have eggs, and that's going to give you a nice balance across the 3 different types. Does that make sense? Questions on fat? I'd like to talk a little bit more about polyunsaturated fats because I know that you all know a little bit more about those. There's a couple types of polyunsaturated fats that we talk about a lot. What are they? You probably supplement with one of them. Fish oil, and that's a type of what? Omega-3, yeah, exactly. So we've got a couple categories of polyunsaturated fats, and those would be omega-6 and omega-3. And these are essential fats in our diet. We do need to have some polyunsaturated fats in our diet. And those omega-6 fats are known as kind of the inflammatory fats, causing inflammation processes. And the omega-3 fats, we call those the anti-inflammatory, sort of the counter-regulators. We need to have some sort of balance of both of them. Now, in hunter-gatherer populations and paleo era, they believed that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats in their diet was approximately 3 or 2 omega-6 to 1. In today's more modern diet, it's upwards of 10, even 25 omega-6 fats to omega-1. So we've got this huge skew of balance pushing us towards inflammation. And inflammation is associated with virtually all of our diseases, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, et cetera. So we don't want to have this excess balance of omega-6. Now, we're going to talk about where we get omega-6 sources in our diet and how we can cut down on that. But in terms of meat, this is kind of why grass-fed meat and pasture-raised animals are going to be more beneficial for us. When meat's raised free range, when the chickens get to roam around instead of being cooped up in cages, they have more omega-3s than conventionally raised meat. And so that's the big benefit, is that you're getting a better balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fats in grass-fed and pasture-raised animals. Now, I don't want you to think, now I know I just talked to Eric and he says that he's got somebody at the gym who you guys have a connection, right, for getting cows, right? You? Yeah. So you guys do have some way to actually get some nice, really quality meat. And typically, if you go in with other people, and you buy a cow, most people can't put several hundred pounds of beef away. But if you split that with some people, it ends up being pretty economical. That being said, I know if you buy this stuff in individual pounds or you buy the really nice eggs at the grocery store, I know there's a price point on this stuff. I know that it can be difficult to always incorporate this. I don't want you to write this off and say, well, shoot, I can't buy grass-fed, I can't do this diet, I can't be healthy. And that's not true at all. If you're going to be buying conventionally raised meat, which is pretty much what's everything in the supermarket, I just recommend that you buy lean cuts of meat. It's not that we're afraid of the fat, or the fat, in fact, we're not afraid of the saturated and the monounsaturated fat, but what we're trying to do with the lean cuts of meat is to avoid taking in this sort of skewed balance of high omega-6s. Does that make sense? And so we're just cutting that out as a source completely for us and sticking with the lean cuts of meat. So with meat, we're getting a really nice nutrient-dense source of proteins covering all of our bases of the amino acids. And also, if you rotate your meat sources, include the seafood, you're going to get a nice balance across the saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats. And of course, seafood is a source of this omega-3s. So again, if we're rotating, we're going to keep that nice balance with omega-6 and omega-3. If you have access to grass-fed, if you have access to pasture-raised eggs, go ahead and include them. That's going to be a better balance of O6 to O3. If not, just buy the lean cuts. So far, so good? Questions on that?
Is there a better seafood, like a better choice in foods and like what?
Yeah, so the question is just about varying the types of seafood and which ones have more omega-3. I can also refer you to Chris Kresser. He's got a great table that kind of shows you per cut of meat and different types of seafood the exact amounts of omega-3s. But generally, most seafood is going to be way high in omega-3, so just go for it. Go ahead.
If you don't eat seafood?
Yeah, if you don't eat seafood, that's one of the reasons you can supplement with fish oil or krill oil or cod liver oil to get some of those omega-3s. The other thing is, you could just minimize other sources of omega-6 in your diet to try to keep those levels more in check. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is it listed anywhere like in the nutrient information? Like if you're looking at something in the store and you're trying to decide this one's high in 6 versus
No, yeah, and that's the difficult thing. So he's asking, will it actually say, hey, this has this many omega-6s and this many omega-3s? No, typically on the back, on the food label, if I'm correct, it always has total fat. It'll tell you saturated fat. It won't necessarily tell you how much polyunsaturated fat, and it definitely won't break it down into those two further for you. And so it's kind of just being aware yourself of, hey, what are omega-6 sources? And we're going to get to some more of them. And meat is one of them, but it's not as high as some other ones. So try to eat some fish and then keep the meat in there as well. Our next thing on there we have is vegetables. And what do we get from vegetables? Carbohydrates? Yeah. And then we also get a huge whack of micronutrients. Starting off first with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, we use these for energy. We don't need to take in carbohydrates. We can do without them. But for high intensity training, for CrossFit training, you're going to want to have some carbohydrates in your diet to be effective. Now, carbohydrates break down in our body into simple sugar molecules such as glucose, fructose, and galactose. And vegetables are really a source of glucose for us. And our bodies handle glucose very well. And so we like this as a source of carbohydrates for us. It's going to be exactly the fuel that we want for most of our carbohydrates. The other thing that we said that's in vegetables are micronutrients, and Loren Cordain, author of The Paleo Diet, has a really great paper out there where he compares the relative ranking and the relative value of all the different food groups in terms of micronutrients. And if you look at that, the vegetables are just head and shoulders above the rest. You cannot beat them in terms of their micronutrient density. So even though I said we weren't going to talk about all the micronutrients, we can't overlook how effective vegetables are for that. So that's pretty much it for vegetables. It's a great source of carbohydrate in the form of glucose. Typically, it's not going to be all of our carbohydrates. As you know, trying to get a lot of carbohydrates from spinach and asparagus is a little bit tough. So we're going to rely on some other sources as well. Moving on, we've got nuts and seeds. And what do we get from nuts and seeds? Fats. Anything else? Yeah, there is some protein in there. And there's also some carbs, right? And of course, some micronutrients. Now let's just talk about the protein and carbs quickly. It's a plant source, so it's going to be an incomplete source of protein. So we're probably not going to rely on that as our majority of where we're getting our protein. And then carbohydrates, again, there's not very many carbohydrates in nuts, so we're not going to use that as our main source for energy either. But we do like it for a fat source. And when you look at nuts and seeds, they do have a blend of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat, just like other foods, but the balance is skewed towards polyunsaturated. And in fact, it's typically omega-6 polyunsaturated. So remember, these are the least stable amount of fats, and omega-6 ones are the ones that push us towards inflammation. So a lot of nuts and seeds give us a good amount of those omega-6 fats, which are not ideal. Now we'll talk about quantity in a little bit. I don't want you to write nuts and seeds off completely. That's okay. But it's just something to keep in mind. Hey, that's a source of those inflammatory fats. Now I know I've heard people say, well, what about walnuts? What about macadamia nuts? Because I've heard those are higher in omega-3s. And they are relative to other nuts, but not relative to like seafood. So they don't even come close. They still have a huge amount of omega-6 fats. So you're not getting away from this high amount of omega-6 fats by eating walnuts. So you're still getting a good amount. Again, don't avoid them. With our blend of meats, with some other sources, you're going to see that you can balance out these fats, but just keep that in mind. Next, we've got fruit, and it says some fruit, and we'll get to that some in a little bit to talk about what we really mean by that. But fruit, what is that as a source for us? Carbohydrates. And of course, micronutrients. It's true with all of these. Now, the carbohydrates that we get from fruit, that breaks down into our body into glucose and fructose. And remember, glucose is what we said is in vegetables, and that our body handles very well. Fructose, especially in large doses, our body doesn't handle it very well at all. In fact, many people are saying that it's really high amounts of fructose in modern diets that's driving us towards insulin resistance and all of those associated diseases. If you're looking for a certain quantity, like how much fructose is too much, I've seen numbers on the order of about 50 grams per day is where you want to be with fructose. Now, instead of going and figuring out all the fructose quantity of foods, in real life application, if you were just to eat 3 or 4 pieces of fresh fruit a day, you're fine. You're not even going to come close to that amount of fructose. Now, if you're taking in a lot of added sugar, if you're taking in, a lot of other sweeteners, you're going to be way over 50 pretty quick. But if we're just talking about from fruit, it's mostly glucose with a little bit of fructose, and in a typical daily amount, you're going to be fine. You don't have to worry about excessive fructose consumption. Questions about fruit? We're good. Yeah. I love that you just said that. Yeah, thank you. Fruit is also a source of fat because olives, avocado, coconut, they are botanically fruits. So we've got avocado, olives, coconut, but they're pretty much sources of fat, right? So they're not how we typically think about our fruit sources. Now, olives and avocado, they are good sources typically of which type of fat? I know you guys know the heart-healthy fats, the monounsaturated, right? So having those in your diet are going to help keep a nice blend across the 3 different types of fat. And then coconut, do you all know what type of fat that is? Mostly saturated fat. So those are technically fruits, and again, if you keep some variety through those and you keep those included in your diet, that's going to help keep a balance across the 3 different types of fat. Cool? Next, we have little starch. I'll just erase all of this. Starch, that's a source of what? You guys talk way too much. Carbohydrates, yes, love it, thank you. And pretty much it's in the form of just long chains of glucose molecules. That's how we see it in plants. It's called starch. So we'll have it that way in vegetables. We'll have it that way, for example, in potatoes and sweet potatoes. We'll have it that way in grains, wheat and rice. We'll have it that way in legumes, different types of beans. And So those are all sources of starch. Again, we really like glucose, our body handles it well, and so this is going to be an additional carbohydrate load for us. Now, I named some food groups that you may have been told or read or heard that you shouldn't eat them. You know, they're not paleo, right? I just said grains, I just said legumes, I said potatoes. And yes, according to the paleo diet, you know, written by Laurent Cordain, he would advocate to exclude those foods from your diet. And the reason that you may want to exclude those foods from your diet is really based on whether or not you have an allergic or an autoimmune response. And I think we all know what kind of an allergic response is. An autoimmune response means that your body cannot distinguish between the proteins found in the food and your own tissues, and so your body attacks itself. And examples of autoimmune diseases are, you know, multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis, and both types of diabetes have an autoimmune component. And so if you're afflicted by one of those diseases, I would wholeheartedly recommend, yeah, you're going to want to play with different food groups. Take stuff out, put stuff back in, and see if your conditions are alleviated. But what we're saying is that you can take your starch choices from any of the whole foods that you want, as long as it works the best for you. Cool, so let's talk about what's kind of left out from this line, and I think it kind of leads into some questions that we get. And the first one is, of course, it's closed with, it says no sugar. And sugar is a source of carbohydrate, of course, and it's a source of glucose and fructose. And typically, wherever we see diseases of modern civilization, obesity, heart disease, cancer, we also see consumption of sugar. And so that's why that we want it to be generally eliminated from your diet, at least not one of those staple foods. Table sugar has about equal amounts of glucose and fructose. Honey has a little bit higher fructose. Agave nectar, which, you know, people will tell you it's paleo, so it's perfect, it's virtually all fructose. Our bodies, again, don't handle fructose very well, and that's probably one of the factors that's really driving us towards insulin resistance, and so that's one of the reasons that we're going to leave that out. Something else that's left out up there is some of our industrial seed oils or our vegetable oils. And these would be things like soybean oil, canola oil, safflower oil, any of those industrial, highly processed oils. And the reason is because they are high in polyunsaturated fats, and specifically the ones we don't want, specifically the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. And even if you're eating clean, it can be hard to stay away from them completely, especially if you travel, especially if you eat out a lot. And that's because they're used in all the restaurants. For example, every time I go out, I virtually have a Cobb salad. It's pretty much what I get everywhere. And any sort of prepared dressing is going to be with soybean oil or canola oil. I've even been to restaurants where I ask for oil and vinegar on the side. They bring out the unlabeled bottle of oil. I say, what is this? It's a mixture of olive oil and canola oil, because they're trying to stretch their money a little bit. It's a little bit cheaper. So what do I do to kind of minimize that intake? I order oil and vinegar on the side, and I just use the vinegar. Don't even use the oil, because you've got this nice meat and vegetables, and then you're just slathering omega-6 on the top. Another way is look at the prepared foods that you get maybe at your supermarket. Even at very healthy food stores, a lot of the stuff is made with canola oil. You know, the vegetables might be roasted in canola oil. So read those labels so you can see, you know, which sources am I getting from that. And another one that I get a lot, especially being on the road, is nuts. A lot of times when nuts are roasted, they're roasted in vegetable oil. So we've got these nuts that are high in omega-6 anyway, and then we've got additional omega-6 on them to be roasted. And so what I try to do when I'm on the road, if I'm going to eat nuts, is just get the raw ones and try to just keep minimizing your exposure to that. Because I'll tell you, every dish that's prepared at virtually all the restaurants are going to be in vegetable oil, so you're going to get a kind of a hit of them regardless of what you do, unless you always sit at home and prepare your own food, which not so realistic. Another thing that's left out is alcohol, and of course that's where we get a lot of questions about alcohol. We do not recommend alcohol as your typical baseline food to what you're going to be using every day. And basically you can think about alcohol as a carbohydrate source, and specifically think about it as like a fructose source. Excessive fructose intake can lead to something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that looks very much like what happens when, you know, an alcoholic or somebody who drinks a lot of alcohol has damage to their liver. And so if you're talking about alcohol, think about, hey, it's kind of handled in my body like fructose, which is not so great, so I don't want this to be one of my baseline foods. Last, that we don't have up there and we get a lot of questions about, is dairy. And one of the reasons that you may want to leave dairy out of your diet is kind of the same reason why you may want to leave any food out of your diet. There typically is one of the more allergen type foods. People tend to have a lot of allergic reactions to dairy and or can be involved in some autoimmune conditions. But in terms of sort of classifying it, it's easiest to sort of mentally put dairy in the meat category. It's an animal source, so it is going to be a complete source of protein. It is going to have some sort of blend across the different types of fats, although a little bit more saturated fat because it's an animal source. And then it is going to have some carbohydrates depending on what type of dairy it is, milk for example, but it's not going to be a source of fructose for us. So dairy, it's kind of shooter's choice, you know? Do you tolerate it well? Do you like it? Take it out, put it back in, and that's going to be your best guide for whether or not dairy is something that you want to include as your kind of baseline foods.
So if like I was going to make a shake and I want to use almond milk, fruit and protein.
Yeah.
Does almond milk fall into that? Like how bad? Or?
The how bads, yeah. Almond milk, typically, if I recall correctly, per cup there's not too much fat in it, so it's not quite the same as having like a cup of nuts. So I would say, yeah, okay, it's better than having a cup of nuts. I would also say when you're looking at almond milk, look at the ingredient list. Make sure that we're getting that maybe unsweetened one if we're using it often, okay? That's step one, right? Because there's the delicious vanilla flavor that's got a ton of fructose corn syrup in it. And there's also some other additives in there, which just anytime you start processing whole food, it's just not the same anymore. So is it the most ideal? No. Is that maybe a choice that you're making to make yourself convenient and have a shake and get some nutrients in? Okay. And there's going to be some tug of that constantly. It's sort of like, you know, think about food not necessarily as yes, no, but as more ideal and less ideal. And what do I want to have be reoccurring players in my diet all the time? And those are going to be the most ideal. And then maybe we'll see some of the less favorable ones kind of pop in and out. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying about dairy. Like whole milk, it's one of those things that some people don't tolerate it well at all. So you can include it in your diet. It's a complete source of protein. It's got a good amount of fat in it, and it's also got some carbohydrates that aren't fructose. So if you handle it well, okay. Yeah.
Some things that I eat, there's soy.
Yeah.
What does that fall in?
Yeah, so soy is a legume. And so again, a lot of people might not tolerate it very well. There are some people who excessive amounts of soy, it's actually a phytoestrogen. It mimics estrogen in the body. And so, you know, it's kind of like the idea, do you want to be taking estrogen? Most people would say no. So it's sort of like how much dosage do you want? There's an interesting book called The Whole Soy Story, which kind of outlines why soy might not be the most beneficial in terms of its anti-nutrient properties. And the soy that we'll see in our diet here in protein bars and, you know, injected in every type of product is very different than the soy products in traditional Asian cultures where they're having fermented soy. It's not quite the same. Our next line is keep intake to levels that support exercise and not body fat. Really elegant phrase. It's like, yeah, that's what I want to do. Totally want to do that. How do I do that? What is that amount? And what's tough about that is, of course, it's going to differ for every person. So I can't just say, you know what, you need 50 grams of protein, and so do you, and 100 grams of carbohydrate, and it's going to be perfect for everybody. And so you kind of have all these different factors which go into play in terms of how much is too much for you and what's supportive of exercise. And that's going to be based off of, you know, what's your current status now? How's your body composition? Is it where you want it to be? Are you performing well? Are you male or female? What's your activity level? What's your current health status? Are there some sort of conditions or diseases that you're dealing with? All of that's going to go into this answer of, well, how much is enough to support exercise and not body fat? So we don't have one specific number. Now, we want as much protein and carbohydrate as we can without excess, meaning I don't want you to have deficiencies in protein, carbohydrate, and fat. I don't want you not to be able to rebuild the tissues that you need. I don't want you not to have the energy that you need. So we want to get this, if you want to think about it almost like filling a gallon jug or something like that, we want to get it all the way up to the top, but we don't want to have spillover, because excess protein, carbohydrate, and fat is stored as fat. That's right. Excess protein, carbohydrate, and fat will be stored as fat. So we're kind of at this precarious level of how much can I have without creating excess. And what we do to determine that amount is we often recommend, or we do recommend, the zone diet. And the zone diet is created by Dr. Barry Sears, and he designed it to be a specific amount of food that you eat to support your lean body mass. Now, how, you guys, do you know about the zone? Can you show hands? Do you all know how to figure out your block prescription? You know how to do that? Yeah, I'm seeing yeses and nos. Nos. Okay, so we'll do a quick run over that. We won't do the full nitty-gritty. There's some great online resources, including CrossFit Journal 21, that can really help you with that. But sort of the amount of food that you get to eat in a day is called your block prescription. And for what I would call a recreational CrossFitter, meaning, we're not Rich Froning, we're not doing a bunch of workouts a day, we're coming in here, we're working out once a day, and we have a typical job, meaning sitting, not manual labor. Your block prescription is really 10% of your lean body mass. And so, for example, for easy math, if I had a 200-pound athlete who had 10% body fat, their lean body mass is 180 pounds, and so their zone block prescription is 18 blocks. It's like, well, great, what's a block? Block is just a unit measurement of food that contains 7 grams of protein, 9 grams of carbohydrate, and 1.5 grams of fat. And so across the course of a day, this athlete would get to eat 18 blocks of protein, 18 blocks of carbohydrate, and 18 blocks of fat. And so to figure out, well, what's a block? There's lots of online charts, so we're not going to go through all of that. But for example, like an ounce of cooked meat is a block of protein. And so to know how much an ounce of cooked meat is, you need to have measuring cups and measuring scales so that you can see exactly what you're taking in. So if you've never done this, if you've never weighed and measured your food, if you've never calculated your block prescription, I encourage you to do so. It's really eye-opening to see, oh, wow, that's how much 4 ounces of chicken is, or this is how much carbohydrates I'm eating throughout the day. What this breaks out to is called 40-30-30 ratios of macronutrients. It means that he's prescribed this in such a way that you're getting 40% of your calories from carbohydrate, 30% of your calories from protein, and 30% of your calories from carbohydrate. We're not married to that ratio. CrossFit doesn't think that everybody should have necessarily a perfect 40-30-30 ratio. What we like about the zone, what we are married to, is the idea that we are assessing exactly what we're taking in so that we can see how our performance tracks with that. We can see whether or not our food is supporting our exercise or giving us excess body fat. So again, I encourage you, if you haven't weighed and measured your foods, to do so, but I wanted to try to make this a little bit more, what I would say, practical, especially when you're eating out or when you're on the road. I'm very sympathetic to that. And so kind of how to make this a little bit more manageable if you don't want to lug your measuring cups and your measuring spoons with you. And so what we can do is, as long as you've got your hand as a reference and your eye, you can be pretty much in the zone pretty easily. And this is the baseline zone. You can tweak it from there. But in terms of the baseline zone, you're going to eat 3 to 5 meals a day. And that's really dependent on if you're a small, average-sized female, that's going to be 3 meals a day. Large female or average male, 4 meals a day. If you're a large male, 5 meals a day. And each meal is going to obviously have protein, carbohydrate, and fat from whole foods, our most nutrient-dense sources. And your protein serving is just the palm of your hand. So not including your fingers, not your thumb, but the thickness and size of your palm. For your carbohydrates, you load that plate with as many green vegetables as you can get on that sucker, and you don't even worry about them. We're not going to count spinach, we're not going to count broccoli. You can fit it on the plate, you can eat it, and we're not going to count it. In addition to that, we can add some additional carbohydrates because it's just really not going to be that much all from green vegetables. And what I like to use as a frame of reference is just a clenched fist, your own clenched fist. So what would be the volume of food that would fit in there? For me, I think that's a little bit less than a cup. And you either get 1 or 2 of those. And this is where you have to know a little bit about food, but not too much. If it's fruit, or if it's kind of like a moderately dense carbohydrate, and what I mean by that, I'd say like beets or carrots, so not a potato, but something that's a little bit more than a green vegetable, you get 2 of those. So 1 versus 2 fists. If it's a high dense carbohydrate, sweet potato, rice, that's when you get 1. You guys with me so far? So as many green vegetables you want, and then 1 or 2 kind of clenched fists. Examples of that would be maybe an apple and an orange, a cup of grapes and a cup of carrots. It might be a cup of rice. Then we get to add fat. What I like to do for fat, you just cup your hand, and what would fall in the little crease in your palm, that's how much fat you get. For me, it's about a tablespoon. So you can see that's not too many nuts, right? That's not a whole jar of almond butter. And this is the baseline zone. If you're already very lean, if you don't want to lose any more mass, I encourage you to multiply that. I would at least start at 3 of those serving sizes, and you can go up from there. If you're more of a numbers person and you want to know what does this shake out to, the total amount you're taking in per meal is about 30 grams of protein, 40 grams of carbohydrate, and 15 grams of fat. Yeah.
For me, I'm trying to gain weight. Where would I be better off in double nutrition?
Yeah, so I would just go up a meal or 2. So if you're really trying to gain weight, for example, I would probably say out of the gates, if I was just going to say your baseline zone, I'd say you'd be 3 meals a day. I'd say at least 4, if not 5. Yeah. And yeah. Now, this is the baseline zone. You don't have to end up keeping all the ratios the same. But what we're trying to do here is kind of establish an initial assessment. And what are we tracking while we're eating this way to see if it's working? Our performance or any other goal you have. I mean, I'm assuming you're here in a CrossFit gym, so you're probably interested in your CrossFit numbers, but maybe it's just your physique, maybe it's some other sporting event, and so you're tracking to see whether or not this diet is making that get better or making that get worse. If your performance isn't getting better, and you want to give this a few weeks, you're going to want to start making some changes. And it's like, well, how do I make changes? Well, you're going to have to start by just tweaking one thing at a time. That's the way to make a really effective choice about what's working and what's not. Maybe you're trying to gain mass. Let's add some protein. Let's add some fat. Maybe you're trying to lean out. Maybe we'll reduce the carbs a little bit. Maybe you're working out a couple times a day leading up to regionals. Fine. Let's just add a whole nother meal. And you can see what's happening to my numbers now. But do you understand that if we don't have an idea of how much we're taking in the beginning, there's no way we can start making tweaks that are any sort of meaningful way? Yeah, so that's exactly why we love the zone. It's an effective way to see, hey, how close are we to levels that support exercise and not body fat? Questions on this sort of eye calculation? Yeah.
How long do you give it? Like 2 weeks?
Yeah, if you want to tweak it, I would give it at least 3 weeks and assume that other factors in your life are consistent, like sleep and stress. Like if you're going through a really bad time at the office or something and you're not sleeping at all, we don't want to use that as our chunk of time as the assessment because everything's going to go down with that. But if it's like a typical training thing, give yourself 2-3 weeks at least to make sure that you know what's affecting you. And that's even true with food groups. If you want to take something out, hey, how does this affect me? Take it out for a few weeks, then put it back in. Do you feel the same, better, or worse? And let that be your guide. So one thing I do want to kind of tackle about the zone is I know people who have gone on it, and I know for myself, you go on it and you're like, wow, I'm still hungry. Wow, I really still want to eat some more. There's a couple things there. One, if you're leaning out, yeah, you're going to be hungry. That's true with any sort of program you go on. If you're trying to lose mass, you have to eat less than what your mass currently is. So yes, you are going to be hungry. The other thing to keep in mind is remember what we really like about the zone is that we're weighing and measuring what we eat so that we can see how that affects our performance. We're not weighing and measuring necessarily 40, 30, 30. So let's say you're having killer performance, you haven't weighed and measured your food, maybe weigh and measure what you're taking in right now that's giving you the killer performance and make that consistent across your days. And then if your performance starts to tank or you want to start to play with something, you still then have a baseline of where you are and where you can go. Does that make sense? So if you want to, for example, not go back to the baseline zone, I'm not going to say go ahead and keep including the peanut M&Ms, but maybe weigh and measure what you're just currently taking in and feel satisfied with. And if you like your body composition, you like your performance, then that's your zone. It's not necessarily the baseline zone. I mean, the other thing is to ratchet it down. So here's an idea. Like if you calculate your zone block prescription and you see that you're, let's say when I calculate it, I'm 15.5. If I know that I'm going to be severely hungry, I might as well just kick that up to 16. Or I might even go to 17 and just be sane for a little while and then come down over time. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm interested more in long-term compliance and you getting a better assessment of what you're taking in than necessarily like doing it for 5 days and stopping, right?
That's what happened. Like I'll be going to Sean and I'm like, I'm so hungry. I
Yeah.
need more.
Yeah. So unfortunately, with leaning out, like I said before, we're trying not to support the mass that we have, so we are going to be hungry. But if we, instead of maybe, let's say wherever you are, let's say that you're eating 16 blocks currently, and let's say that your prescription is 13 blocks, instead of jumping down right to that, let's go to the in-between step and then ratchet back again, and maybe that gradual transition can help.
Okay.
Is there anything bad about eating the same food 3 meals in a row? I would say no, but I would say over the course of weeks and multiple meals that we'd want to see some rotation of food choices. And that's just because we're going to get a better array of the micronutrients, a better fatty acid balance. And so if, is the worst thing in the world to eat chicken, broccoli, and sweet potato and olive oil every day? No, it's not the worst thing in the world. Can you do better? Probably. Rotate those meat sources, rotate those fat sources, so you get a better complement of all of the micronutrients that we need.